Hello. Right, now I'm going to continue with yesterday's reserve requirements and capital requirements. This is going to be more capital requirements. Front page, FT Alphaville, the EBA, the European Bankers or Banking Association 9% rule and the Eurozone crisis by Isabella Kaminska. I put that up first because I didn't want to have comments on the front of the presentation again. Because I think I've decided this morning that there aren't many of you out there that really understand this. I'm presuming that the ones that are willing to comment are getting close to understanding it and are representing you. We should all applaud them and thank them for putting forward their questions so we can all get closer to understanding this whole thing. And this is truly the whole thing. We can think of subprime mortgages, credit crunch, and 8, 10, 15 millions of people in America and in Europe out of work because of it. This is the base of it. We can think of going further than this, under this base, but for our normal talking about things, besides introducing energy into the equation and a couple of other things, another couple of other things would be the way the actual banking system is set up. But the way the banking system is set up has caused a credit crunch, which has caused mass unemployment, and this is the reasoning behind it. And if we don't get the understanding of this, then the rest of our understandings are not on a solid base. So I'll push on. Yeah. Okay. Emishlan Todd just re-listened to the middle again and had an oh my god moment. Are the shareholders the pension funds? Hello. Effectively, for our, I've often put it this way in comments when people have come up with this just let the banks fall sort of idea. I've just generally said it's not completely correct, but it's best to always think that it's not banks that are going to fall when banks fall, it is pension funds. Okay, and I know it's not quite right, but it's just to squash that idea. And that is why my tell the banks to piss off theory won't work. And I'm sure Amish Todd is one of the people that I've just written it to in the past. When it comes down to it, your pension fund, your pensions, the baby boomer pensions are invested in places, and generally when we think of default here or bank blow up here, it's those that are coming under the hammer. The pension funds will be wiped out when the sovereign debt is defaulted on, so everyone is screwed along with the bankers. I've got to try and keep this video under 20 minutes, but imagining Greece, and they're talking about the default, they're talking about a voluntary default or a hard default, but what is ever's defaulted on are sovereign bonds. Sovereign bonds are held by banks. They're not held by banks because banks are rich. They're held by banks on behalf of, on the side, brackets, there are people, banks, investment banks that trade on their own account, but we're leaving that out, and we're saying banks invest for, and we're putting it in under a heading, pension funds. The banks that have bought this debt generally, it's not for them just to look at and stroke, it's for pension funds. So when you're defaulting to pension funds. It's not that direct, but for this video we're saying it is that direct. These defaults, these Greek defaults, are going to default on pension funds. Now, there's lots of complications. The ECB has taken lots of that debt onto its books and replaced it with cash and all sorts of other things by buying the debt. So it won't be too tragic for the banks stroke the pension funds when Greece defaults. But that's all part of it, yes, of course. And in the structure, which we're going to get to, equity, The owners of these banks are the pension funds. The bondholders of these banks are the pension funds. For our thinking here, subordinated debt, call it middle debt, and the top guaranteed senior debt, all pension funds. So when you're saying, oh well, burn the bondholders, yeah, there are some billionaires that are just buying bonds in banks, but imagine it for ease of thinking and for the great understanding that there is no easy way out. The equity is owned by pension funds. All bonds are bought by pension funds. Okay, because we're going to come on to that later in this presentation. Go on to Ricardo's. Nick, I think you need to increase capital requirements because Basel III increases reserve requirements. Why? Question mark. I still think bank reserves deposited at a central bank are capital. Sorry, Ricardo. They don't give a shit what you think. Okay? Reserves are reserves, capital is capital, and as I said in a comment yesterday, this is horrible because they're words, and different trades, accountants, bankers, central bankers, economists, and other people talk about these different things in different ways and label them differently. So in a way you can be right, but in another way you're wrong. And I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I've kicked against this all my life, going along with what people say things should be called. I prefer to call everything a thingamajig. But in the real world, that doesn't get you very far. Down to CSA Ricardo, thinking. Sorry, I have thought about this further, but I remain confused, it's beautiful honesty, and this is the way we get at facts, or at least what we can think are facts. You should not talk about capital in regard to a balance sheet. It is better to say owner's equity. Okay. And again, I've made videos, I can remember making the video on an Andrew Haldane speech at the LSE, saying it would be so much easier if we didn't call it capital, we called it something like owner's equity, or just equity. Yeah, and I'll come into this later, because we're going to go to this article, the EBA 9% rule. Did I want to go through this particular bit? I don't think I did, actually, but let's go to the bottom in the darker piece. Recapitalisation of an undercapitalised banking system will, over the intermediate term, merely fund the necessary asset contraction, just as it did in Japan in 1998 and the US and the UK in 2008. Now, this has caused me so much anguish making this video. It's because I'm realising that I do snippets of things like the necessary asset contraction in the US and the UK in 2008. But quite frankly, these are little bits of the jigsaw, and I think most of the time you haven't got a clue where these pieces go. And I don't, but I'm highlighting them, but it's easier for me to kind of go, I can put them together easier because I'm kind of the central thing here. But what we've got here is the asset contraction just as it happened in Japan 1998. So, of course, we're talking Richard Koo. So, next, 1D. Bring in Nomura's Richard Koo, who is the man who literally wrote the book on the Japanese experience. Yeah, I've quoted him many times before. He expressed the following about the role played by the EBA's new 9% capital rule in the crisis in a research report this week. Okay, now, again, I've got to think for you lot out there, and it's so difficult. There are many of you at understanding different amounts, but I've got this horrible idea that I've caused a lot of you to watch this cartoon, the Something of Debt, whatever it was. You remember cartoon back in the YouTube days? And you'll be looking at this and go, he expressed the following about the role played by the EBA's new 9% capital rule, and you'll be going, oh, well, that's something to do with the 10% in this fractional reserve banking thing, won't you? It's got fuck all to do with it. Nothing at all. And that hasn't altered your thinking in the slightest degree. There's nothing I can say that is going to stop you thinking that. It's there. And I would have to get you in a room for a whole afternoon, having prepared days beforehand lots of information and going, no, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, to get that sort of idea out of your head. It just won't shift. But it's got nothing to do with it. Believe me. Reserve requirements, to an extent, have got something to do with it. This is capital requirements. 9% sounds vaguely like 10%, but it's got nothing to do with it. Anguish here. I don't know who to speak to. So, to a greater extent, I'll talk to Ricardo and Amish Todd and Sned, who have been asking the questions. The biggest bottleneck, EBA's tough new rules. This is Richard Koo speaking now. The next question is, what is preventing the funds supplied by the ECB from flowing into the real economy? Okay, this is, again, what I put these snippets in, and what we have in real life. The world is not, it's not getting there. And Richard Koo's trying to address this, but I think to a certain extent he's wrong, but it doesn't matter. Flowing into the real and improving economic conditions. Although there are a number of answers, the biggest obstacle from a policy perspective is the European banking authorities' tough new capital rules. Right, I'll go on and see what comes to mind next. The EBA, that's the European Banking Authority, has demanded that European banks raise core Tier 1 capital to 9% of risk-weighted assets by June 2012. Okay, now there's no way in this video I can go anywhere near telling you about what Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 and what even risk-weighted is. But you'll get a hint from a lot of you have written in comments, so you do know that sovereign debt was risk-weighted as 0, let's say. And mortgage-backed securities were risk-weighted at 25% of capital you needed to back those. That's the risk weighting. And this is Tier 1 capital. Capital, these are the assets. We're talking about the asset side. This is what they give a loan. It goes over to the liability side, the money. The asset, the mortgage, for example, or the sovereign bond, goes on the asset side. Yeah? Ooh. Right, assets. Okay, none of these policy unveiled in response to the crisis has been so counterproductive. Koo says this is a dreadful idea. A tightening of bank capital requirements would not create major problems in an ordinary world without a financial crisis. If only a handful of banks are in trouble, asking those institutions to raise more capital would not lead to major macro-level problems, because other financial institutions would be willing to supply capital to those banks or increase lending in their place. In other words, if things were normal, one or two banks had got things a bit out of whack on their asset side, one particular country there was an asset boom and bust, it'd be all right, but it's all over. Now, there's a particular bit that I know that I'm going to be twigged off again. But with a financial crisis already in progress and the sector undergoing a systemic crisis in which a majority of banks face the same problem, demanding higher capital ratios will trigger a destructive credit crunch, as I have argued previously. So what he's saying is they're trying to make the banks safer for the future, but in the present, they're only making things worse, because the banks, to make themselves safer, have to do things. There are two things they can do, and I think we'll probably bring that out on the next one, 1F. This is because sources of additional capital during a systemic crisis are extremely limited, and for many institutions, raising capital, if possible at all, can be very costly. Now, this again, I can hark back to, say, Andrew Haldane. This is their language, Ricardo. This is the language they speak. Raising capital is selling shares. Capital, it's in a way the normal use, and harps back to the beginning of the use of the word capital. I've got 100,000 money, and I want to start a business, and that is my capital. I'm a capitalist if I start a business with my 100,000. If I need 200,000 and I go in with Bill or Aunt Daisy and they put in 100,000, our capital now is 200,000. Aunt Daisy and Bill are half owners and I'm half owner. That's the capital that goes in. That's capital, yeah? And that's just what they've always called it. But the more important thing is here, raising capital, if possible at all, can be very costly. This is the shite that I've talked about, that banking has just got itself over decades down to raising money on the bond market. They get their capital in, they get the money in through the bond market because it's cheaper. But this is what I said in another video. Johnson & Johnson doesn't work that way. Deere tractors don't work that way. Coca-Cola doesn't work that way. I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But they have Bill, me, and if we want to open a new factory in China, we get Auntie Aggie's sister in as well to raise capital. But what the banks say is we have to then give them big dividends out, and their dividends as a percentage of the money that came in is more expensive than just selling debt in the open market as bonds. Subordinated debt's is expensive because it's subordinated debt, and if the bank moves closer towards bankruptcy, the equity goes first. My money, Bill's, Auntie Aggie's and her sister's money goes first, then the subordinated debt holders, then the middle debt holders, and then the senior debt holders that are pari passu equal with the depositors. That's the structure of it. And the important thing about all this capital shit is because the central bank can only deal with solvent banks, not insolvent banks. So what the bank has to show it first, to have all these fine things flying around from the central bank, first they've got to prove iffy. It's well iffy at the moment for all the banks of the world, but they've got to kind of juggle their balance sheets so that it looks like they're solvent, so they can get all the bonuses from playing with the central bank. Okay, but first, that's what it's all about. That's all this is about. And because Lehman Brothers couldn't do it, they couldn't make their balance sheet look good enough to be solvent, so the central bank could play with them. As I did with SNED, RBS and Lloyds in the United Kingdom couldn't make their bank balance sheets look good enough to look solvent, so the central bank could play with them. So the government had to come in and buy shares. Me, Bill, Auntie Molly's sister, and the United Kingdom taxpayers came in as equity. Yeah, that made the balance sheet solvent enough for the central bank to say, all right, I'll take all this long-term assets off you and give you cash instead on your asset side. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're already in time trouble. So it's ridiculous that banks raise that money always on the bonds, selling bonds, and so little on the equity side. That's the major problem. They should be, I rarely go in for cures for these things, that's got to be jacked back up again. It wasn't like that 50 years ago. They should all be raising money as equity, so their books are open for everyone to see. More people own shares in it. They are more liable to be cut if the chopped. They're the buffer if the bank is insolvent. But there's plenty of equity, but the banks don't want it because major shareholders, the huge amount of shareholders, are the owners, and they tell the managers what to do. The banks don't want that. They want to operate in their own little world and have bondholders. All bondholders want is their money back. Equity holders want they can have much more upside. The shares can go up or down, and if the shares go up, it doesn't affect the amount of capital that's in the company, because you've bought the shares at a set price. You know, it could be 25p shares or $1 shares. That's what's gone in, and then these shares float on the stock market afterwards. And I've gone completely off what I was going to talk about. But that is purely so the central bank will play with you. or it won't play with you. Illiquid means, because I'm sure I'm going to have to explain that, illiquid just means that you've got plenty of assets, but they're stocked up in 30-year loans, and you don't want to sell them to pay off the liability side, which are the deposits of the depositors. So as long as you're solvent enough, the central bank will say, okay, I'll take the 30-year stuff, I'll give you the short-term debt. Short-term debt is cash, actually. So the short-term debt then can be used to pay any depositors that might want it. And that's really got to have to be the end of this. As a practical matter, the only way banks can satisfy the new capital requirements if raising capital is difficult is by reducing the denominator in the capital ratio, total assets. If the banks try to do that at the same time, the result will be a destructive credit crunch. I don't know about denominators and numerators, but they're not going to be able to raise the capital, so they've got to reduce their assets. The reducing the assets means they've got to sell assets. If they sell assets, it's a fire sale. Asset prices go down. More asset prices go down. That reduces the overall amount of assets on the value of the assets on the asset sides of the banks, and it's all agony for them. And the last thing they want to do is start pumping more money out to people via liabilities, which would then give them more assets to hold on this side. And what's the point of having assets to hold on this side if you're selling them and the value of those assets is going down? There isn't anything. And that's why they're not lending, not even there's people there to lend, but they're not lending because of that. And I might even have to speed this video up. Okay, questions very welcome, and we'll get to it together. Thanks very much. Bye.